I think everybody can hear me. I get this back echo that suggests you can hear me. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our inaugural 2022-2023 Shop Talk. It is such a delight to open this series of conversations that will continue our exchange of ideas throughout this academic year. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lindsay Harris. I'm the Andrew High School Arts Director here at the Academy. And we are so pleased to be able to welcome everybody here. This is an unusual venue for our shop talks, hence the small delay. It takes a bit of extra effort to get the tech set up, but it's a wonderful forum in which we can hear today from our two inaugural shop talkers, and we're very grateful to them for volunteering to go first. It's always great to start early and fuel the conversation about your work all year long. We will open today with John Davis, the recipient of the Rome Prize in Design. I like to think of this as the Wild Card Fellowship, and I think John might take the cake for the wildest of cards. The first professional pianist that we have had in this category, who's also doing a whole host of other things that are quite fascinating, about which you will hear this morning. And partnered with him today, we have Monica Rhodes, the Adele Chatfield-Taylor Rome Prize recipient in historic preservation, who also comes to us with a whole set of different hats. This is not quite as wild as the design card, but also one that does push the envelope on what we mean by historic preservation at the Academy. And we're very excited to have a different kind of format today for the shop talk that will begin with a performance by John and then a conversation between the two of them that they'll facilitate completely on their own. So with that, thank you very much to both of them. Thanks to all of you for participating. There will be time for questions, I believe, perhaps throughout, and maybe at the end of their presentation, I'll let them field that. So thanks very much, and thanks both to you.
That was, of course, The Rainstorm by Thomas Wiggins, the once enslaved pianist from Georgia, who is more popularly known as Blind Tom, over the course of a 50-year career as a virtuoso pianist, an accomplished composer, as well as a shamelessly exploited circus sideshow. Wiggins performed in virtually every corner of the United States, many times over. He toured France and England. He maybe was the first African American to ever perform for the president at the White House. And during the flushest periods, it earned for his owner, that man James Neal Bethune, and subsequent handlers, upwards of $100,000 a year, equivalent today, and this may be very modest actually, about $1.5 million a year. In short, he became a phenomenon, the first black superstar performer in America. And so he is the subject of my work, and it turns out that Monica and I have all kinds of parallels in our work, and that's hence why we've chosen to do this together. So I want to talk to her about all that kind of stuff. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, John, and good morning again, everyone. It's great to see you all in the crowd. Again, when I met John at the opening or our reception in New York, there was an immediate connection, and we connected through music. So getting the opportunity to have a chat with him for this first shop talk is an amazing experience. I'll say before we get into our presentation, we planned for this storm to happen. And so all about planning and execution. So thank you, John, for that beautiful performance.
I spoke to the gods while we're in Rome.
So the title of our talk today is Reframing Cultural Memory, Places, Soundscapes, and the Future. And so when we were coming up with this title, we spent some time really thinking through what is the connection in our work, and we'll certainly get into that in our conversation. But when we got down to the bare bones of it, the work that we're doing in my work in preserving historic buildings and stories, and John's work in music and stories, there's a connection there. And so we thought this was a perfect way to describe the work that we do and the passion that we have for our professional tracks.
For sure.
So I'll say, kicking off, so a lot of the pictures you'll see are behind the scenes footage of projects that I typically don't show. So usually when I do presentations, I'm showing the nice, shiny, edited versions of these things. But because we are talking about the process of preservation, I thought it was important that I also share out a little bit of how these things come together. So at the left side here, when we think about historic preservation, and I think about my work, it's really the act of engaging all of the senses in the past. So when I started my career, I was trained as a historian, but really wanted to figure out a way to connect people deeper to the work that I cared about, beyond textbooks, beyond lectures, and get them to step back into a world where they could access a piano that Nina Simone played or see her bed. And this is in North Carolina. Or up at the right, telling stories about national parks and expanding narratives around how stories are told. And that project is in Montana at Little Bighorn. And about 20 years ago, they were telling the Battle of George Custer, General Custer, and when the Native American tribes got involved, there were 16 of them all together, they expanded the stories that are told now at that national park site. So, these are the lessons that I was learning as I was thinking about, well, how do we go beyond what we typically think we know about a place, and how do these histories exist all at the same time? And then finally, at the bottom, when you're thinking about place and being able to connect to people in the past, this is from a church in South Carolina, Reconstruction National Historical Park in Beaufort. So this is a place in the country where they tell that story with the national park system. And this is First Baptist Church, and these bricks were made by people who couldn't worship in the church. And when Reconstruction came, those people who were shut out of that sacred space were able to access it, and they still worship in it today. And so this is over 150 years old. This congregation has been in place and is still going. So when we think about reframing cultural memory, very on in my career, I also learned that it's about the money and being able to raise the capital and get people excited about this work. So these 3 projects are from a program that I ran for American Express and the National Trust for Historic Preservation called Partners in Preservation. So this was the 10th year of the program, and it was based in the DC metro area. And the key lesson for we thinking about reframing the narrative around this is how do you get the larger national community involved in voting on projects at these particular sites that they wanted to win. So on the left-hand side is the Washington National Cathedral. Up at the top is Carter G. Woodson in DC, and at the bottom is Congressional Cemetery. And then when we were chatting a bit more, we had to dig a little bit deeper about what do these places really mean beyond fundable opportunities, beyond stories. Well, in the case of Channel Island National Park and many national parks across the country, they serve as places to welcome new citizens. And so these are one of the things that I really enjoy about visiting national parks are these citizenship ceremonies. And the superintendents always say, very proud to have you at this time. We're very excited to welcome you to your national parks now because they were now citizens of the country. And then thinking through how do we involve, young ladies in the process of historic preservation through the trades. And so those are some of the ideas that I was thinking around. And then as I dig a bit deeper, I thought about, well, what are the next layer of stories that are being told when we involve other people who are not even thinking about history, thinking about preservation, thinking about money, any of that? How do they get involved? Well, in the case of Hinchliffe Stadium in New Jersey, Negro League Baseball Stadium, we got local artists involved. So if you remember my initial talk, 700 volunteers came out in one day. And how do you organize those volunteers? Where you incorporate the history of the site into the organization of those volunteers. So we had 5 Negro League baseball teams painted so the people who came to volunteer knew exactly where to go. And the artists, hadn't had a chance to connect to this site. The place had been abandoned for 20 years. And so weaving in history as a volunteer strategy to be able to preserve these historically significant places was definitely a way I was thinking about how do we connect cultural memory to a place, to volunteerism, to helping to create and expand a national park. And then at the top was just a quick shot of one of the contractors in Louisiana teaching one of the participants how to tie rope. We were framing up a timber frame structure. And then over here to the left, you see this refrigerator, and then there's a small indention. So this is inside the home of Medgar and Marilee Evers, which is a national monument. And their daughter is very active. Marilee Evers is still alive. There are not many national parks named after people that are still alive. And that bullet was the first bullet that came into the home before Medgar was killed in his driveway. And that's still there. It's still interpreted as a national park, and it will be open very soon for the public. And then finally, this is the part that that many people don't think about, which is how do we leverage federal dollars to be able to have impact to help us think through cultural memory and the act of it. So I was a part of an effort, the Great American Outdoors Act, which gives funding to the tune of $1.9 billion over the next 5 years to national parks, forests, American Indian schools, and recreation areas to help with critical infrastructure upgrades. And so this and other projects help me think around cultural memory preservation at scale, and how do you tie real dollars to be able to change the narrative of the nation. And then finally, it's a short clip or a video of a young man being interviewed on the steps of Nina Simone's house. And so when we're thinking about who gets to tell the story, this young man was very nervous. We talked the night before, we talked right before, giving him the talking points to be able to do that, but he was empowered to be able to tell that story, and the 160 other projects that I worked on were building confidence because these young people had the opportunity to not only preserve a historic building, but they were empowered to be able to talk about it in front of a camera, which was a new skill set. So again, thinking through the places and the soundscapes and how important this is as we think about what this means for larger conversations in our future.
Thanks, Monica. Actually, when you that earlier picture inside Nina Simone's house where I saw the Bach score up on the organ there, it reminded me that Nina Simone was initially a classical pianist and went into sort of singing and the version of kind of soul music she did, she's sort of a unique figure in African American music, and you can actually hear that she was a classical pianist in her piano playing. It's like no one else's. And the reason she ended up going into that line of work, so to speak, was she was rejected from all these major music schools that were not open to African Americans at that point in time. So I don't really operate on as grand a scale as Monica. I'm just a lowly itinerant pianist. And but I got involved, and I'll explain a little bit later how this happened, but in basically playing all this music having to do with early African American culture, and had a lot to do with my upbringing and things like that. But because it was a field that was so poorly documented, I had to ultimately find the primary source material, which is the basis for my actual work, and through a lot of allocating resources and time to this, I managed to sort of create this pretty large personal collection of all this kind of material that filters into all kinds of work, and it's broken down into various categories. Here are some early books about slave songs, which grew out of actually African traditions that came over with the first enslaved people, and then merging with Western musical traditions, and that's where these kind of plantation songs and slave songs, and the book on the right, in fact, is by the first book about African American music by an African American, a guy named Marshall Taylor, and this is probably the first book ever that came out about African American music right after the Civil War, and that's part of my collection. And then there's another area, concert music, I would say, and here I featured just a few vocalists. There's a big vocal tradition in African American music. Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield was probably the first famous black singer. On the right is a much more obscure one named Rachel Walker. I've only seen passing references to her from Cleveland. And then in the middle, I wanted to make reference to a series of vocal groups that emerged out of the historically black colleges, most famously the Fisk Jubilee Singers, the Hampton Singers, the singers from Tuskegee. But this is a maybe slightly lesser known group called the University Singers of New Orleans, from New Orleans University, that was eventually, I think, absorbed into what's today Dillard University in New Orleans. And then another category is theater music, and this involves that kind of pariah of American music and basically the beginning of American show business in minstrel shows. And on the left is the poster from Callender's Georgia Minstrels, which was the first black minstrel troupe. Originally, minstrelsy was a white people in blackface prior to the Civil War, and then once emancipation hit, they got African Americans to be part of this, and some of the greatest early performers of African American music honed their skills on the minstrel circuit, namely Sam Lucas, who's known as the grand old man of the African American stage, as said by James Weldon Johnson, and he made some of the first inroads into doing serious black theater and black musical theater, not owing to minstrelsy, and that the show that sort of started that off was called Out of Bondage, which featured him and this group called the Higher Sisters, these two sisters who became very well-known people in their own right. But for me, as a pianist, one of the more important things is I was able to establish that there was a kind of unacknowledged continuum of early American pianists who were either African American or inspired by black culture that started way back, even in like as far back as the 1840s, beginning with Louis Moreau Gottschalk, who was sort of a well-known person actually in the music world, but not so much beyond. But he was from New Orleans, and he and his sort of Crescent City contemporaries, which I'm involved in now, and I'll explain that later, started it all off, and then it went through to Blind Tom here, Thomas Wiggins in the middle, and then ultimately to Blind Boone, another sightless black pianist from Columbia, Missouri, whose music ultimately had an important influence over the Kansas City big band music of the 1910s and 20s, and now we're into the recording era. And then these have led to recordings and concerts, as well as, if you could do the next slide too, writings. And what happened ultimately, I thought, wow, these artifacts are actually really interesting to look at. I hope you agree, in and of themselves. And I decided, why not do an exhibition of this stuff? And it's another way into telling the same story and into the same story. So this is what I've been involved with in my work for 30 years.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way for us to transition into our conversation that we've had about values as we think through the why of our work, the importance of the things that we do. And one of the things that I focus in on, the type of work that I do is negotiating not only my values, but thinking about what are the values of the nation? You know, how are they represented? Who do we say we want to be, and what do we preserve now to think about who do we want to be in the future, or what are we telling the future about who we value, what stories were important about our cultural memory and legacy.
Monica, before we go ahead, I was really interested, I don't know if you mentioned it today, but in our conversations we've talked a lot about that she's memorializing, in some cases, the mundane, like a building that's not really of any kind of real architectural significance, but it has a whole story and a history attached to it. Well, I feel like I'm sort of doing the same thing. I'm playing an end of the music world that was previously either ignored or totally dismissed for a host of reasons, called parlor music. And it's kind of a hybrid of kind of classical music light with vernacular music, and up until recently, it's been sort of looked down upon by the classical music establishment. But if you have the patience and the willpower to look through thousands of mediocre pieces of music like I have, you come up in there are a host of gems, and that's what I focused on, and that are pieces that are kind of aspiring to something greater, I think.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that brings us into a conversation as we're thinking about, who we are and why we do the work that we do. And so, as John and I were, again, practicing this and just chatting over dinners and lunches, we were able to share some childhood stories, and we were able to situate ourselves and really think back and see that there has been this through line in the types of things that we've done starting in childhood. So I just figured I'd share this one story of me playing t-ball here. So there was, I grew up playing t-ball into softball, and my dad is notoriously late for doing things, and my mom's not. So that year, my dad was responsible for signing me up for t-ball, and he waited until the last minute, naturally. And there was one team left, and that team was we won a lot that year. But I also learned something very important. After that first practice, I remember going home and asking my mom why didn't I have headphones or earphones like everyone else. She looked at my dad, and then she sat me down, and she told me that they experienced the world a little bit differently. Because they were either deaf or hard of hearing. And before that moment, I had never encountered anyone that was deaf or hard of hearing. And so when I went back, I certainly had a great summer experience. But that was a lesson for me to I decentered myself at a very young age from the world around me, and that it was important to be able to navigate worlds and people are navigating spaces in different ways, and there should be space and room for them to be able to do so. And then up at the top, while I was, also playing t-ball, I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, which is why I'm a lover of history in many ways, and was listening to a lot of Robert Johnson and Nancy Wilson as a kid. And so that was one of the things we connected on early, our love of Bobby Blue Bland and Muddy Waters and all of those folks you'll probably hear blasting out of my room.
Oh, sorry. We might hold a little disc spinning event while we're here for everyone who's interested.
And then finally, I heard stories growing up of a situation, a horrible situation, a lynching that happened in my hometown of Waco, Texas. And so, family members would would point throughout time, like, okay, it happened around here. But to this day, in 2022, and that lynching happened in 1916, there's still no marker about that, and that happened right outside the courthouse. And so this is a shot of the Silent March in New York in 1917 that W.E.B. Du Bois and NAACP organized to bring attention to the lynchings that were happening in places like Waco and Memphis and the massacre in East St. Louis. And so all of this activism, history, music, difference were swirling around and were really foundational with how I was approaching and understanding the world that I was entering as a very young person. And then I went to college, majored in history, took an internship, and this was funded by Preserve America, which was focused in on exploring and documenting African American history in the state of Pennsylvania, excluding Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, which means I spent my summer, this is about 15 years ago, in Meadville and Scranton and Williamsport, and I was super excited because, as we know, Williamsport is the home of the Little League Baseball World Series, so I was excited to be able to go there. And then a picture of young me, and this story ran in the local newspaper when I was in Lewistown. And so as I moved in my career, this idea of difference and being inclusive as possible, so designing these programs for Hope Crew, or these projects, I was thinking about, well, how are people young at heart who are 70 or 80 experiencing these sites? And how do I make sure I'm being inclusive about creating opportunities for them to participate in something like cleaning headstones, or young people in New Jersey who repainted the stadium, but in other projects, they were paid to do something, create an economic opportunity for people to access an industry that's a multi-billion-dollar construction industry in the preservation world. And then finally, on the left-hand side, creating worlds for people to access. And so you can see my avatar there in the blue, but this is a historic site in Baltimore, and we put on a virtual event in a program called Second Life, where people who are differently abled or disabled, caretakers, people who want to see other parts of the world, experience it in different ways, have the autonomy to do so. And we were talking about on this session making historic sites more accessible. And one of the ways to do it, if you can't come to the historic site, you bring the historic site to people. You bring the stories and experiences to people in creative ways. And so these were some of the things that, as we thought about it, I thought about and reflected on my past, how I work in partnerships with communities, how I approach the work that I do. It was really foundational, and we talked about putting ourselves in these stories, and the fact that objectivity does not exist, and we all make decisions based on life experiences.
Thanks. Yeah, well, just to get back to my beginnings, how I even got on this track, I was lucky enough as a little kid when my older brother came home, and he's the less cute one on the right, and he
he's now a medieval Chinese historian, but he's a bluesman to the core. And when I was about 10 years old, he brought an album home that is still in my collection, entitled More Real Folk Blues by the late but still great Mississippi bluesman Sonny Boy Williamson. And from the minute the album's opening cut came on our little Radio Shack stereo, you know, we were just completely hooked by the intensity of this sound that we had previously only thought was possible in classical music. And from then on, we vowed to learn everything we could about African American music and studied every form that we knew, from soul to gospel to blues to funk and even earlier slave songs and work songs and things like that. And what it eventually led to is we also read local literature of the time, not local, but very popular at the time, of particularly the Black Arts movement, people like Eldridge Cleaver and Leroy Jones, who eventually was known as Amiri Barak, who eventually actually wrote one of the liner note essays for my Blind Tom record 30 years later or something. And then we also, of course, the civil rights movement was exploding all around us and on the news every day. So this was formative in our upbringing. I kept going with this, as did my brother. We started to go hear music, and when I became of age in college, I went to hear all these people, all the people still alive on the National Blues Circuit, as well as classical concerts, and unfortunately, almost every one of these people, in fact, they're all dead. And it shows how ephemeral this history was, and there's no one really has come to replace them in any way. But, and then eventually, I went to music school. When I got out of musical, I had to face the music, so to speak, and decide, what am I going to do with my career? And I decided I had sort of changed as a person with all this two worlds going side by side with me, classical music and African American music and culture. I don't think I was going to be that happy just playing the music of Chopin and Beethoven as a pianist in the late 20th and early 21st century, that the world had changed around me, and that I wanted to do something new that was a little more relevant and a little bit spoke to who I had become as a person. And I decided to try to link these two fields, and I started to find music, and I told you I had to create my own archive. And very interestingly, 30 years later, my brother and I went to the gravesite of Sonny Boy Williamson at this in this overgrown cemetery, an abandoned church in the middle of a cotton field of Tutwiler, Mississippi. And we came upon this amazing headstone. It had been previously unmarked. And speaking to a little bit to Monica's field, this church, I went back to this site 10 years ago. I couldn't even find it. What I didn't know is that the church had burned down in the meantime, and all that was there was a kind of modest, charred foundation. And so this history, it's almost a race against the clock to preserve some of this stuff.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, that brings us to another point that we've talked about is, how is our work connected to activism? Because it's all, when I think about the fact that preservation often says, it's this bipartisan issue, and it is. Preservation does well on both sides of the aisle, but it's also about the decisions that we make and the stories that we want to tell, of course, as I've shared. And in the case of Sonny Boy Williams II, not the first, right? Yeah, there are two of them. Yeah. So, if that also speaks to an issue that we have in preservation, which is who's invited to be a part of the conversation, and what sites are we saying are architecturally and historically significant. These are all, terms, integrity, that they're all subjective, but yet people are at the table making these decisions that often don't represent the history that they're talking about, they're not grounded or rooted in these conversations. So, they're often cast to the side. They're not protected. They don't get the funding. They don't get the support and the infrastructure around them to be able for us to see and experiencing them as significant. The Preservation Office in Mississippi would have thought that story wasn't important enough to preserve for Sonny Boy Williamson II, that church would have been preserved. It would have been on the National Register. It would have had the level of protection that these iconic places that we think of also have. So when I was thinking about my work through the lens of cultural preservation, I thought about this project that happened a few years ago in New Mexico at Bandelier National Monument. And this was our first all Native American Hope Crew project. And they worked for about a month on a place, or a Tioni Pueblo, which happened by happenstance. These young folks were also connected historically to that same Pueblo. So them getting to be able to work on a site that was 1,000 years old was very exciting to them. So much so that one of the young people who participated wrote me a nice note on a plaque about this summer being an amazing experience. And this experience is something I will remember for the rest of my life. I enjoyed every second of it. So being able to create these transformative experiences, and no one had ever asked if young people were interested in being a part of the preservation of these iconic sites. And this program asked and answered that question. It's always yes. Yes, they are. We just have to create the opportunity for people to do it. And then when we think about cultural preservation as a form of activism, it also made me think about a project I did in partnership with many people in Virginia and in the Department of Interior about a site called Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia, which is, if you've read Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 project at Point Comfort, this is the place where, this is what she's talking about here, where some of the first Africans landed in 1619. But the story that is also left out of that conversation, or wasn't included as a part of that conversation, was the fact that this was also one of the endings of slavery in 1863, when 3 African-American men showed up to the Union Fort at the time, escaping terrorism and slavery. And before they came, before that, the practice in the Union was to turn people who had escaped slavery back over to the Confederacy. And General Benjamin Butler decided not to do that, and that was called the Contraband Decision. And it set off this wave across the South through forts that were owned by the Union, where African Americans were started to escape away from the Confederacy. And here at Fort Monroe, it eventually became known as Freedom's Fortress, because tens of thousands of black folks escaped and self-emancipated themselves at this fort. So shortly after the Civil War, those same folks set up schools and churches. And so when it came time to think about, well, how do we designate a place where some of the first Africans landed, it was also an opportunity to connect that story to that national moment. And that was part of the work that I did down there in support of an effort to make it a national monument. And so those 8 churches I identified and connected and built trust with those pastors and wrote a letter on their behalf that eventually went to President Obama. And so right at the corner, you can see Reverend Clowry, who got a chance to be in the Oval Office as President Obama used his power under the Antiquities Act of 1906, where presidents can create national parks and monuments. And so that story is now forever a part of our national memory, a part of our national parks, and it goes beyond telling the story of where some of the first enslaved people landed, or the fact that Robert E. Lee built some of the fortifications, or that Jefferson Davis was in prison there. It's also telling the story of self-emancipation. So layering these histories. And then I saw it as an opportunity years later to do the 100th Hope Crew project at Fort Monroe. So here we have Terry, who is the superintendent on the left of the park, and then Darrell, who was the first Hope Crew member who participated in the program to be hired by the National Park Service. So how do we again, think about how do we leverage these stories to create economic opportunities, to get people into jobs, to shift trajectories of people's lives. And then on the right here, this is right down. This is also Fort Monroe, but a few buildings down from where General Butler made that decision. And under this porch, there's a signed Hope Crew 100th project that will live there probably for 100 years until it's time to restore that building again. And this participant here, she led the project, but because she participated in the Hope Crew program, she now works for the World Monuments Fund and is leading work at that level. And then on the left-hand side here, preservation and activism. So we talked about HBCUs. In fact, the Medgar and Murray Evers House was managed by Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi, before the National Park Service took over. And this is a program that I started in partnership with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the National Park Service, and the National Trust, and Morgan State University to be able to train students who are enrolled in architecture programs and in historic preservation. So again, creating pipelines for people to enter the preservation field through different ways. And then up at the top is a project in New Orleans where this was this young man's great-uncle, and they had the opportunity to clean his headstone. And this is at a national park site, and typically people can't touch national parks. So this was I think his name was John, and his mom were able to do that together. And then finally, thinking about preservation and cultural preservation and activism as a strategy against climate change. So this building here at the bottom was damaged by Superstorm Sandy in 2012, and through the program, it was completely restored. And then here's just a quick shot of a project that happened again in Montana, a different part of the Little Bighorn Park, where we trained veterans to be able to work in a veteran cemetery in the park. And again, creating an opportunity for women to lead these projects, and that's Carrie with the Historic Preservation Training Center. And another shot in Vermont and down in New Orleans, again, as we think through what this work is really about, it's really this conversation with the future and really thinking and being intentional about ensuring that as many people as possible can access our stories of our past and be a part of not just the fact that these buildings are preserved, but be a part of the preservation and the act of them.
Great. That's really, I mean, as far as, I view what I do, just the mere actually performance of any of this music is a form of activism and bringing this music to the general public. But also what's been interesting is given what's all going on in the world right now as far as diversity and things like that, I'm really happy to see that a bunch of other musicians are starting to play the music of Blind Tom and Blind Boone and these other people that have been sort of in the weeds for literally a century and a half. And so all these things are really part of the sort of activist underpinning of what I'm doing, even though it's a little maybe what's the word? It's not front and center to what I'm doing, but it's definitely a huge part of it. It's sort of the silent underpinning of it. But here I just wanted to point out that here are two people, Blind Tom and Blind Boone, who were promoted very differently. And Blind Boone, you can see on the left, Blind Tom, the focus of the publicity was always on the kind of curiosity aspect of him as a kind of circus freak. And he was portrayed by his owner and handlers always as a kind of a freak show, and they'd focus on, say, that he'd play 3 songs at once and sing at the same time, and he'd play with his back to the piano, and that he didn't know a flat from a sharp, and he had no musical education whatsoever, even though the truth was completely opposite to that. The minute they discovered his talent, he was fed teachers nonstop for virtually his entire career, and he, by all accounts, and there are numerous accounts of him studying this music, he was a very hard worker and practicer and very intense about his work. On the other hand, then Blind Boone comes along, who modeled his early career on Blind Tom's, and they even had a famous playoff in 1880. And Boone, who was only 15 years old at the time, this playoff launched his career as the headliner of the Blind Boone Concert Company that toured the United States for the next half century. And what was interesting, that very early on, even though he modeled his early career on Blind Tom's, the Blind Boone Concert Company moved away from the Blind Tom model. And they created this company motto that was clearly a direct reference to Blind Tom, called "Merit, Not Sympathy, Wins." And this group wanted to be judged on its merits. And there were, by all accounts, many of them. There were singers involved and other musicians, not just Boone. So that was a very important thing. Another thing they did, and Tom and Jennifer, the few people I know have ever even heard of this, they knew of Blind Boone, and they said, wasn't he the guy that said, I'd like to put the cookies on the lower shelf so everyone can get at them? And it may be on one of their artworks, as far as I know. And that was a phrase that Boone used to talk about how he wanted to present African American music in an inviting way for everyone, and including blacks and whites in the audience, and expose the world to the beauties of African American music. My activism is occasionally taken more concrete manifestations. And this came up with Blind Tom when I first started to learn about him, and this is in the late 90s, mid-90s. I read somewhere in a newspaper, the Chicago Defender, that he had been buried in an unmarked grave in Evergreen Cemetery in Brooklyn, 15-minute drive from my apartment in New York. And I said, well, I'm going to head out and check this out. And I went to the front gate, and they couldn't find his name in the ledger, and then because he had many different names, eventually I said, how about Thomas Wiggins, which is his given name? And they said, yeah, he's here, Pleasant Hill, Section D, and this guy came and had to escort me, and I didn't yet totally know why, and he came with a map, and I followed him for 30 minutes, and he points down to that dusty, bare, headstoneless spot, and he says, this is it, Pleasant Hill, Section D, this is the spot. And I went, wow. And so I immediately got this idea that at some point I might take on a role that even a lot of rock and rollers have done in Mississippi with some of the Mississippi bluesmen that had unmarked graves, and maybe try to see if I could get a headstone put on top of his grave. And it turned out, I heard from the cemetery that some blood descendants of Blind Tom had also been out there because of an article about one of my records that mentioned it in the New York Times, and they had sort of the same idea. So they put us two together, and I found and they formed a whole family reunion about to get a headstone, and we all sort of contributed money to this, and Steinway Pianos was nice enough to bring a piano out onto the cemetery, and it was an excruciatingly hot day, July 1st, 2002. And we were left with this amazing headstone. If you go to the next one, I played a piece at this, and here's the headstone that's there. And now for everyone to see forever. So that was a fun thing.
Yeah. I really like that idea, or that quote by Blind Boone of putting the cookies on a lower shelf so everyone can get to them.
Oh, it's a great quote.
And I think it perfectly describes what we're talking about in our work, which is making this work more accessible, that past more accessible. And as another point that I thought about, at a time in the U.S. when people are being removed from textbooks and certain narratives are being highlighted and others completely erased. This work serves as a counter narrative, as a counterbalance to what's being erased from our conversation, for what young people are no longer learning about, to what around books that are being banned. Being able to visit these places, seeing this headstone, seeing these sites that are preserved, those types of things, can't be erased if they're protected, and even if they're, again in this season or this moment in time pulled out of our cultural memory, these things will still continue to be there. and be able to be accessed by a large number of people. And then the last thing I'll say is, as I was thinking about and looking at those pictures that I put of when all these different people wearing the same type of shirt. So, and thinking about that as activism, what I've found out is that people, they found pride in being able to be connected to someone, a young white lady in Vermont was very happy to be connected to a young black kid in New Orleans. An older Latinx woman in Texas was in San Antonio, was happy to have the same shirt to see that people were similar, thinking about the same mission, committed to preserving the historic sites. And there were thousands of people who had these Hope Crew shirts. And as I reflected on it, like it's saying something about people's need or desire to be connected through our heritage and be able to be impacted and have a role in that was something that I discovered as a nice surprise on the back end as I was looking back through the work and thinking about the stories. It was people's desire and desire to be connected to something bigger than themselves. And that shirt did exactly that.
Can I throw something? I just want to throw on that note. I agree with you. I think this is about, I'm not sure we would be going through what we're going in this country if there was more of this kind of stuff and programming going on, and fortunately it's starting to happen more. But, I think as a musician growing up, I was always shocked that my well-educated friends had no idea that how much an influence of black music is on all of American music, and that, I was just lucky enough to have been exposed through actually almost like a serendipitous event to this, and it changed my life. And I think, but my whole life I've been aware of this, and I think if the culture at large were also have that same awareness, it would break down a lot of barriers.
Oh, absolutely.
You're bringing out the activist in me.
Yeah. And in some
I'm
ways,
getting worked up.
Well, in a lot of ways, thinking about the work of the Academy and the work that we're all are doing, we should be thinking about how does our work connect to these larger audiences? What does it mean in this current moment to be in the places that we're doing, to leading the work that we're leading? We should have that those things in the back of our minds. And so it brings us to the point in our conversation where we talk about what we're working on now here at the Academy. So I am currently pulling together conversations with heritage practitioners both in the U.S. and looking to meet practitioners here in Italy. To the left is a project that I led in Tuskegee and creating opportunities for folks who have been doing this work for 50 years with their hands, who are quickly retiring from the workforce and taking the skills with them. So if you think about the average age of someone who knows something and know their way around a historic building is 65, you can come to the conclusion that we are in trouble if in the next few years if we don't get serious about training the next generation of trades professionals. And then up at the right is just a shot of a project in North Carolina where, again, thinking about the transference of skills from one person to the next. But if I'm going to be thoughtful about scaling this work, then I'm thinking through how to make these a series of conversations that live online. And so that's one of the things that I'm working on while I'm here. And then thinking about this idea of storytelling, I love telling stories about the work that I've done in partnership with so many others. So this to the left is Machu Picchu, and so visited that at the beginning of the year, and I spent most of the time talking to people who were actually doing the preservation of the site, and it sparked some ideas in my mind about the need to, of course, not only preserve these places, but also tell stories about the people who are actually doing the preservation, because there's value there, there's stories there, and there's a way for people to connect deeply with the folks who are actually doing the work. Same in Arequipa, that's a visit at the Stone Quarry, and at the bottom, this was a monastery where the nuns are leveraging this as a historic site to be able to bring in money for the convent, which has at this point about 50 people left, when at its height it had about 600 nuns. So they have had to shift their business model and using preservation as a tool to help them think about that. And so I'm also spending some time thinking around the business of historic preservation and how people are leveraging that. And then outside of that, I sit on the board of the Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites at the University of Pennsylvania. So this is at Tuskegee. We are working to preserve civil rights heritage throughout the nation. Again, most people think that civil rights history is locked in the South, and we know that's not the case. And so being able to be thoughtful about where we are making our interventions is critical there, and not to mention that many of the civil rights sites, because that history was 50 years ago, now a lot of it is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And then, as I'm telling these larger stories, I got a chance to be featured on This Old House, talking about the work of Hope Crew. And so Norm recently retired. So the last episode, I was featured as a in a small part on that episode, on that segment. And I hadn't had a chance to watch it yet, but my sisters let me know that Martha Stewart gets a little bit more airtime than I do, but that's okay. And finally, one thing that I think we should all be thinking about, because we're doing important work, is how are we telling stories about ourselves, which is important. We are a part of our stories. We're a part of our why. And so I now have a website. And when I started my career, I was behind the scenes and didn't really need to think that I needed to be up front and center in this work. And I realized people would often ask me, how did I get into this? Why am I doing this? Why is this important? And that's a part of the story. And so I'm spending some time thinking about what is the messaging that I'm telling about the work that I'm doing, and how do I put myself in conversations with other people who are also doing this. And so social media and websites and these public things are the way that the strategy that I'm using to connect to these larger audiences to deliver the great news about historic preservation and conservation.
You mentioned Tuskegee. I had the honor really to give a concert at the Tuskegee Institute, now called Tuskegee University, which is one of the great colleges founded by Booker T. Washington, and to play, it's kind of like sacred territory, and I played in this chapel directly next to which was buried Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. And after the concert, a college girl comes up to me and says, "Oh, we'd like to sing something for her." And I said, "Who's we?" And all of a sudden, this whole chorus gets up on stage in blue jeans. They're not dressed up in any way. And they sing me two spirituals arranged by a famous black composer named William Dawson, who taught at Tuskegee University. And I was so, moved by it. I kind of said, I don't really want to know what to say except thank you. I'll never forget this. And it was an amazing moment,
And in fact, Tuskegee is a national park site, and it's not another university in the country that's also
really?
a national park.
Yeah,
it's managed.
Incredible. Well, it's an amazing place if you ever get a chance to go there. And the chorus is a famous chorus, actually. So I just wanted to get to my work. Up to now, I've been mostly concerned with the kind of I've identified kind of this continuum of pianists, and I've been mostly concerned, at least publicly, not really privately, with the mid to latter part of this 19th century keyboard continuum, but I've always wanted to fill out the picture with the early part of this keyboard continuum, which took me to New Orleans, as so much American music does. The beginnings of it occur there. And so I'm involved with, I've spent 30 years looking through something like 30,000 pieces of early New Orleans sheet music, which is very rare. There was a big music publishing business there. It started in about the 1820s. And, but the first person to ever become a famous pianist from the New World was this guy, Louis Moreau Gottschalk, who I mentioned already. And he wrote the first known piece, at least, of concert music influenced by African American music called Bambula, which was theoretically based on an African dance and drum that was danced in Congo Square, which was a famous place in American musical lore, just off the French Quarter and near his house, where it was one of the few places in the antebellum South where free and enslaved people of African descent could congregate and play music in the 19th century. And he likely walked over there, as did so many people of all stripes, and he saw something being done called a bambula, and it led to this piece that he made famous here in Europe, actually, when he made his career, actually, initial career in Europe, in France, and in Spain, and touring Spain and France and Switzerland, I think. And eventually, so that was a piece I found. And I was drawn to all these pieces, actually, that were connected to the vibrant African-American and Afro-Caribbean culture that was already going on in early New Orleans. That was one thing that became clear by all this music I was looking at. And so I found other pieces connected to Congo Square that I've also recorded and played. And then here, if anyone knows any, I'm sure some of you have been to New Orleans, and you know about the party atmosphere of New Orleans. Well, nothing is more of the party there than Mardi Gras. And I found a whole bunch of Mardi Gras pieces, probably one of the best of which is by this guy Basile Barrez, who was a virtuoso pianist and maybe the first enslaved person, even before Blind Tom, to become a published composer. And it's a kind of a Mardi Gras waltz. And I found here's another Mardi Gras piece, interestingly by a woman. And one thing that's being clear, there were numerous women composers in early New Orleans. And this was, if you hear it, sounds like a brass band piece that's just been literally transcribed for the piano. It's very awkward to play as a piano piece because it's really brass band music. And to me, it reminded me, the brass band music tradition is very important today, even in New Orleans. And here's an example of a second line parade, what they call a second line parade, that's I actually participated in and held every one Sunday a month, at least in New Orleans. And there are all these famous brass bands that play as part of the parade. Then, of course, the banjo is a huge instrument and foundational instrument in New Orleans. And here's an early a depiction of a banjo-type instrument. Of course, the banjo came from Africa, and that a guy named Benjamin Henry Latrobe, who was an architect, an English architect, saw when he visited in New Orleans in Congo Square. So there was clearly those types of instruments being played there, and these banjos sort of filtered into some of the early 19th century brass bands that were precursors to what became jazz. You know, ultimately Jelly Roll Morton's Red Hot Peppers had a banjo, and it's a foundational instrument in New Orleans music. And of course I found two banjo pieces. Oh, actually more than that, but these are two of the best, and Gottschalk's is quite famous. But I found this other one by Maurice Strakosch, who's a Czech pianist who had a long connection with New Orleans and wrote a banjo piece, a very interesting banjo piece, like a few years before even Gottschalk's more famous cousin. Then, of course, there's voodoo culture in New Orleans that came from refugees of the Haitian Revolution that eventually migrated to New Orleans via Cuba, most of them. And of course, today that's memorialized voodoo culture mostly with Marie Laveau, the voodoo priestess of the 19th century. But here I found a piece by this guy W.T. Francis called The Voodoo, and actually a couple more. And then also the other element that I was interested in was the so-called Spanish tinge that Jelly Roll Morton speaks about in the famous interviews of him in 1938 at the Library of Congress. And there were numerous pieces that ode to Latin American music. Here's a piece by Lucien Lebert, who is a Creole African-American man that was a contemporary of Gottschalk that migrated to France and never came back to the United States because of racism, and I found this in France, and eventually ended up in Brazil and taught a famous composer, Ernesto Nazareth, there. And here's a Cuban-influenced piece, and here's a Mexican piece. There was a whole bunch of Mexican music that came about because of an appearance at the 1885 Cotton Exposition by a Mexican military band that apparently must have been incredible because it inspired a lot of pieces, okay? And I'm in the process of recording them. I've already recorded them, but editing them here at the Academy, all these pieces, and also I've been invited to curate an exhibit at the New Orleans Jazz Museum related to this, so I'm formulating that exhibit and writing the chapters in the book I talked about to the Academy having to do with New Orleans. So that's the work I'm involved in here.
So you can tell that all our shared values, the work that we're working around. So John and I are already talking about future projects together, which is very exciting. And before we certainly want to open the conversation up to the audience now. So if there are questions about anything that we've talked about or comments, we'd love to invite you all to join us in this discussion that we've been having for about a month now in preparation for this talk. So if there are questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we will pass the microphone to you.
Yeah. Sure, Sarah?
Oh, I can repeat the question.
Oh, okay. My question is, John just talked about your collection of music and things like that, and you just mentioned that you're curating an exhibition of New Orleans jazz.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Oh, sorry.
I can't hear a thing, so you gotta really,
I was just saying,
too much loud funk music in my life.
you talked about your collection, and you talked about how this is possibly going to be in an exhibition, but just thinking about the preservation of history and into the future, what, I guess, do you hope to do with this collection? I mean, you can keep it, or...
Well, that's a good question because that's starting to come up
John.
now. Oh yeah, that's a good question, and that's starting to come up, and I've actually, and I've seen people wait too long to try to get rid of their collections, and that's a problem. And I was recently approached by a big museum about the possibility. A lot has to go right for this to happen. It's a protracted process, and I'm not even sure I want it to go there, and I'm actually don't even want to. I need it. It's a working library. It's not like something I just have as a trophy, and it's actually something that every day I'm pulling things off the shelves and looking at things over and over, and I notice things I never noticed before, things like that. So this is an issue, but it's coming up now, and I might have to sort of make some arrangement with any institution that might want it. And if it's going to go soon to somebody, it would have to be somewhere conveniently located to me, in New York probably. If it doesn't, then it might have to wait, or maybe you could make some arrangement with them where they buy it or you donate it or whatever, but they get it only at a certain point. I'm learning about this process myself. It's a difficult issue, and I know lots of amazing collectors who have great collections that should go places and may never end up in them, though.
Thank you for your wonderful conversation. This question is from Monica. So I'm a daughter of the South, and I'm seeing, especially with the rise of Black Lives Matters, Confederate monuments, that question of them being destroyed or removed. And I wondered if you might be able to speak to these monuments having a dialogue with others, or what your take is on that movement and how we can address, because at a certain point we have to think about other histories being erased too, and how can we thoughtfully, not memorialize, but maybe contextualize?
Yeah. So the conversation, or the question was connected to Confederate monuments and what types of discussions should we be having around them, and how should we reframe or frame them as we're thinking about our future. And so I would say that is one of the hottest issues right now in historic preservation, which really gets to the point of who do we want to be, and what part of our history are we really valuing? I certainly think that there is a balance to be struck there, in the sense that the International Council on Monuments and Sites is pulling together a toolkit to help cities and municipalities more largely think about what's this process of removal. right? So when these things first started in New Orleans and Baltimore and other places, they were coming down in the middle of the night and raising a lot of public concern about this wasn't a democratic process. We want to be, people want to be included as a part of as a part of the decision about what goes down and what stays up. And so this toolkit will open a conversation for this to be a larger discussion that the city has, the community has with itself about what stories does it want to tell for people that are coming into the city. Or do they want to add more monuments to this, which I think is also should be a part of the conversation as well, like expanding the story and being thoughtful about like what comes down and when does it come down. And then the last part I'll say, one of the things that I've witnessed, working at parks around monuments, was that these memorials, these places are, they're kind of like lightning rods. The people like go to them. So we remember watching in Charlottesville, they went to the Robert E. Lee memorial with their tiki torches. But what didn't make the news is shortly after George Floyd was killed, that other folks were going to, the Harriet Tubman Monument and gathering around these places. So I think it demonstrates for us how important these sites, these memorials are as gathering spots. And then the question becomes, well, how do we want to gather, and what do we want people to connect to? Do we want all of these, Confederate monuments for people to walk around in circles with tiki torches? Or are we looking to expand that narrative to ensure that we also have Native American representation on the landscape, and that we also have, in addition to these Confederate war memorials, but that we also are telling stories about more women on the American landscape. So I think this is an evolving conversation. Certainly don't think there's a right answer to this. I think each city is going to have to decide who they want to be and make that a public process as much as possible.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation, conversation. I have a question for John. It's very strange to speak in this microphone. I'm curious about your archive. Just, one is, of course, just like where and how you collected it, but maybe just how you started as well, and when you started realizing that you are building an archive. Because if you're talking about a history that's not really known, right, the sources are also quite strange, and maybe it started off also with an unexpected beginning. So
it actually did. It sort of snuck up on me, actually. What happened is I sort of realized if I was going to do this work, and that the documentation of this is so piecemeal, and it's in all, there's little dribs and drabs, and this institutional library, and a little bit over here, and you have to understand that also this was a little bit before the internet had become such a big deal, and I kind of just started looking for this. And actually, one of the interesting things is another family connection. My father was, at this point, had just retired as a medical school professor and gone into the rare book world as a kind of, he just was having fun. He never really made this into a really viable business, but for fun. And so, but he used to go looking for stuff, and then he'd invite me in, and I was never interested in this world, and all of a sudden I found this area that I was interested in. I started going to rare book shows. I now have friends who are rare book dealers. I know all these private collectors, and it's a very grassroots pursuit, but it started very innocently at first, and it started just growing, and then it became this obsession of mine. And so I'm constantly looking. Every morning I'm shaking before I look at my eBay things being sent to me, and every day. And I've actually bought a few things here, and it makes it a little more difficult. I had a problem getting this very rare thing I've been looking for 20 years for something about this person, and they couldn't deliver it to my door in Brooklyn. It didn't get delivered properly, and I've been dealing with trying to get it back. And it's like it's an incredibly fun thing to be involved in, but the stuff is getting harder and harder to find, and this is not glamorous stuff. Usually it's sort of like dog-eared, and it's a miracle that any of these things have really survived, given how you know, they were just so dismissed by the general culture. But it sort of just started pretty innocently, and then I got heavily involved in it. I'm an addict.
Thank you both for this wonderful presentation. I have a question for Monica. And I'm just you've been involved in this aspect of preservation for more than a decade. And it seems that with the current climate of a desire of certain groups in the US to want to erase particular histories of you know, of slavery, people of color, of different kinds of things that happen to different groups in the United States. And there's it seems that there's this new urgency to the work that you're doing with telling these stories and reaching out to communities. And I'm wondering if that, if you could address some of that, if you felt that, this newer kind of urgency to your work, for example, in the last few years, as opposed to when you began doing it, and there was perhaps a different political climate.
Yeah, that's a good question, and thank you for asking. You know, what's the connection between my work and the urgency of this moment? And I will say, you know, as a student of history, you know, it's always something that's been urgent to me, and it's why I decided very early on that I wanted to work at a national scale, because there are not enough stories about women preserved. There are not enough stories about you know, Native Americans preserved, Asian Americans preserved, the disability community preserved, and the work that John is doing with Blind Tom and Blind Boone, and incorporating them back in, or putting them back front and center as they should be in American history is key. I do see now that there's certainly more funding for this than it was 10 years ago. So being able to leverage this body of work into these larger conversations to make deeper impact is something that I'm currently thinking through right now. So it's certainly important. I would also say, and we've talked about this at lunch, is using these historic sites to be instructive about the moments that we're in right now. If we think about kids being taken away from their parents, well, there's a long legacy, not just for African Americans, but also for Latinx, also for Japanese Americans, of this ripping apart of families and communities. And that's instructive, and we should be learning from those lessons. And we keep repeating these things because we keep forgetting that these happened. And when we have these places preserved, when we're having these conversations, I think that it reduces the likelihood that we will find ourselves here again in the next 50 to 100 years. And then the last thing I'll say, and this kind of goes back to a question that Denver asked about the Confederacy in the South. I did this project in Tennessee, cleaning headstones at one of the 14 cemeteries, national cemeteries that the Park Service manages, Stones River in, where's that? Tennessee. And one thing that, one story I'll share is, 250 people came out to clean headstones, and there were 4,000 headstones that day. But one of the people stood out. He came up to me very early in the project and shared that he wanted to learn how to preserve headstones because he wanted to take the skill set back and to preserve Confederate memorials and a Confederate cemetery that the U.S. no longer takes care of. So those are largely overgrown, largely abandoned, largely forgotten. And I had to think about that. And I said to him, join this project, because if you care about the history you say you care about, no matter how I feel about it, and you want to gain a skill set, instead of carrying around a flag and saying this history and heritage is important to you, learn a skill and be able to preserve the places that you think that matters, because those cemeteries are not going anywhere. And if he wants to be a part of the preservation of them, then that's his prerogative. And he enjoyed his time working to preserve this memorial. But I think that, or the cemetery, but I think that also says that there are we have to break away from because we don't agree or because you have a different political agenda for whatever reason, that we can't find some commonality in a heritage in the past that makes sense to us all. And so he preserved United States colored troops headstones at that cemetery. And was very proud to be a part of that story. And so there's all these chapters, and people and history and places are complex. And there's not these black and white moments that we can just say it's this or that. And I think we're at a point in time in our nation's history where we just can't say either or. It's a both and we have to figure out how to get on the same page in some type of way. And the way that I've done it is leveraging these heritage sites to bring communities together that normally wouldn't be talking to each other, and getting them on the same page, if only for nothing else, but to preserve a site that we know is nationally significant.
Can I add something? In terms of your question too, I mean, in Sarah's question, in this, as far as my own archive, I mean, I don't think it's an accident that I got approached recently by this museum. There's a lot of pressure now from these institutions to answer to the Black Lives Matter movement and all that's going on. And this museum, I have to grapple with this idea because this museum is a wonderful place, but it's absolutely a pillar of white supremacy, this museum, in just its history. And while I'm glad they're trying to maybe do something to change that, and it would be in some ways a wonderful place to have this stuff land because they know how to preserve it and proper, I have to grapple with, do I want it to go to a place like that, or do I want it to go with somewhere else? And these are issues I have to deal with. I mostly want it to be in a place where they really preserve it, they keep it together, and they make it readily available to anyone who wants to come in. And that may be part of my demand to them, is that you have to make some concerted effort to bring people of color into this place to look at this kind of stuff, or do an exhibition or something of that nature, and really have people that try to court a different audience than they've had over the years. So that's kind of a little bit.
So,
Okay.
One final question. And then
okay.
Okay.
Sorry, my question actually speaks to what John was just saying, and it speaks a little bit to sort of the overall discussion, but more specifically to John's project. And that has to do with just some of the things that you mentioned about the way that you got into this project, how it was sort of happenstance, how your music school training very much did not point you in this direction. And so what I'm wondering is, especially as someone who teaches music history and who, when I first heard about your project, immediately saw how important it would be to bring into the classroom and to bring to students of all backgrounds, and in music schools where historically these types of repertories have been either ignored or undersold to the point of, really not doing them at all any justice. And you mentioned Gottschalk, for example. One of the big reasons that we know that Gottschalk is more well known in music circles is because one of his pieces is included in one of the big music history textbooks.
Oh, really? I didn't know.
That is, that creates essentially one of these very problematic canons that right now the field of musicology and music theory are sort of fighting against. But so what I'm interested in is not just how the book project that you're working on here is potentially going to speak to students of music, but also to how you might find ways of bringing your own process into that. And I guess this kind of breaks into the broader project of making historic preservation accessible to larger audiences, and how, I find it really inspiring that you actually went through the process of building an archive. That's something that I teach my students about from a historical perspective, but it's quite rare to see someone actually sort of doing it. And so I wonder how both the process of you playing and archiving this music and this sort of end result could be sort of married together in a sort of pedagogical and sort of accessibility-oriented project.
I mean, I don't have any university position. I've been autonomous, but I always enjoy teaching. I've been invited to, give presentations at various universities, and in fact, speaking to the archival work, I was invited a few years ago. There's a very well-known African-American historian named Daphne Brooks, and she invited me to give a lecture before all her graduate students about archival work and how archival work relates to performance. And Daphne has even written a thing about Blind Tom. She knows all about him, and so I have done things like that, but I basically, and this is maybe my own fault, I got used to a certain amount of autonomy, and both intellectual and just personal, and my brother, who's a professor, he said, "I think you did the right thing," and I always think I should be teaching at a university, and he said, I think you did the right thing. But basically how I got into this, I sort of decided I didn't want to be teaching. It's not that I don't want to be teaching. I actually love teaching and do teach a bit, but privately. But I kind of early on, I said, I saw what happened to a lot of pianists when they go into a university setting, and it's kind of the last you ever hear from them again. And I decided I don't want to look back when I'm 80 and go like, God, I should have done that. So I decided to roll the dice, and I said, oh, well, if I become well known enough for this thing, then maybe they'll come and offer me a job. That's never happened.
All right. John, that was a great way to end our discussion today. So, we wanted to thank the audience. We appreciate the questions, the comments. We look forward to continuing this conversation with you all throughout the rest of our time here at the Academy. We also want to thank the staff and the American Academy in general for the opportunity to have these conversations. Coming in, certainly was aware that I would encounter so many great minds and deep discussions, and I think this dialogue that we've had today, John, is certainly a testament to how amazing this place is in bringing together a pianist and a preservationist in discussions around our love for music, our personal stories, our shared values, and how our work is really moving the needle on conversations we're having as a nation and as a world. So,
and I want to thank Monica.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been a great privilege to get to know her and do her work.
So thank you all again. We will see you at lunch.
All right. Great job. I think it went really well. Good energy.
Yeah.
But I didn't look at my notes too much.
Bravissimi. I've never seen two people take so hard as pairing of ideas. It was just wonderful. Congratulations. Thank you. Thank you. It was great. Thank you for your questions.